Because often we're people that we kind of have to crash the car ourselves to then learn the bigger lesson. Often, people give us advice and we just need to experience it for ourselves. And so it's really that journey. And I wanted to just show the importance of expressing yourself and dealing with the things you go through. Because if you don't, they're going to come back and find you, usually at the worst time.
Hey, I'm Tanya Wilkinson, and this is Death on the Daily, bringing the conversation about death out of the shadows and into the mainstream. Because along with birth and change, if there's one thing that's going to happen to us all, then death is it. And we're going to explore how death actually shows up for us on the daily in a multitude of ways, and how when we allow ourselves to accept and to be with death, how it can teach us a whole heap about how to live this life well. Our written words are powerful, and when it comes to loss and grief, letting our words flow onto the page is therapeutic and can help ourselves to heal. But beyond that, should we choose to share the stories that we write of grief and loss with the world? They can actually help others to see that what is so unspoken in our society is just a normal part of being human, helping us all to find our own path through. And my guest today is doing just this at such a young age, catalyzing profound loss into powerful storytelling. Micah Dawanyi is an author, an illustrator, and speaker. His books include Battle Scars and Blossoms, A Journey Through the Mind, and When the Record Stops Spinning. Fictional stories that are built on the layers of his experience with loss, including the death of his professional soccer dreams and whole identity aged just 15 due to a life-threatening heart condition. So Micah, welcome to Death on the Daily.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Oh, I'm so excited for our conversation. And let's root straight into your story because you've got such an incredible story and one where you've been through a lot, particularly at really seminal moments as a teenager and how you have navigated life beyond a very big loss. So let's dive into your story.
Yeah, so we were talking about the squiggly line of life, and it's definitely been that. When I was a kid, it was very simplified, actually. I was a big football, soccer fan and a player. My dad got me into the sport when I was about 6. And it's funny because I missed a whole season when I was 5 because I didn't want to play. Apparently, I've always been the kid who, if he doesn't want to do something, he just won't do it. And my dad offered to get me in, and I was like, no, I don't want to do it. And then for some reason, the next year when the season came, I was like, okay, let's do it, let's do it. And so I got in, and it was recreational at first, but then I quickly developed a skill set, and then had to move to travel, and then an academy. And when I moved to the academy, that was when I was playing with people who were either as good as me or people older than me. I was playing a year up, so I was in a very competitive academy where we had a coach who had trained under some of the Real Madrid coaches, and he was very technical. And here in America, the sport wasn't that popular. Most kids wanted to play basketball and football, and a lot of people didn't understand why I got so invested into the sport. But it was a real passion, and I just fell into it year after year. And I found myself traveling. If I had any time away from school, I was probably on the road to a tournament, and I'd have double practices. And my friend group became pretty cemented in all of my teammates. I mean, I had school friends as well, but I mostly hung out with my teammates, and it just became my world, and I don't know where it was going. I just know that I found a lot of purpose and identity in playing the sport. So it was really devastating when at 15 I had to quit playing due to a life-threatening heart complication that got pretty serious and then prolonged, and the doctors couldn't figure out what was happening to me. I had about 3 collapsing episodes, 2 on the field that were very traumatic, could have been life or death. And it quickly got to a point where the doctors were like, we can't clear you to play because if something happens to you, and it's going to be on our hands. So we can't even clear you to practice, train, anything. So at 15, I pretty much got my entire world ripped from my hands and had to find what does life mean? Where am I going to go now? And
Mhm.
so that foundation, that devastation led to new foundations. I got into writing and coaching and advocacy, and we'll get into all of that, I'm sure. But that was my pivotal moment, and I wouldn't even be who I am now without that.
That is such a big pivotal moment and such a big loss at
Yeah.
such a young age as well, at that age where I'm sure that those dreams were feeling like they're starting to come into reality on that journey. I'd imagine that dream of becoming a professional athlete. So before we go into the rebirth that is in your life beyond, I'd love to just root into that experience for you and what came up when it comes to grief of that loss.
So it's really interesting because I think a lot of mental health conversations have become very recent. And I feel like I'm still very young myself, but growing
Mhm.
up, being an early 2000s baby, that we didn't have that emotional toolkit necessarily. So I don't think I used the word grief until the early 2020s when I was going to therapy. I don't
Wow.
even know if I could have identified that there was a form of grief outside of physical, tangible death. And I'd experienced that. I had a teammate who passed away in a tragic accident, and
Mm.
I was able to conceptualize that kind of grief, but I don't even know if I knew what was happening to me. But it definitely was grief. I remember a very distinct longing for wanting to return to that space in soccer. And I know one of the difficult things is when I had a childhood that was up and down, and soccer became kind of a form of escapism in a way from things I was going through at school or in the house. And so to lose that and to not have a place of comfort to return to, I did feel pretty lost and confused. And I think the perception of other people affected me. I was very worried about my friends viewing me as a failure because I couldn't play with them anymore. And I stayed in the group chat, so they'd be texting. I just scored 5 goals on the weekend. I just put a hat trick in on our rivals. Micah, how was your weekend? Watching a new Netflix series and blah, 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 playing FIFA. So I remember I went through that period. But interestingly, I think because I didn't have that emotional toolkit to fully sink in with my emotions, I pivoted very quickly. And it might have been a coping mechanism to just distract myself and not have to think so deeply. But I quickly got my national coaching license and I started a nonprofit training business. And there was a lot of advocacy and community focus there. But I do think a part of it was holding on to the sport,
Mm.
desperately clinging on to something connected to the sport. I do think that was part of the
Wow.
motivation. So yeah, it was a whole whirlpool of emotions at that time.
Wow, and I think that's a really important acknowledgement as well that anything even nowadays, grief, there's such a lack of understanding that grief can come up in so many of life's experiences and everything that you went through at such a young age to not be able to contextualize it. But also what I could hear there as well was that, and which is completely understandable when we go through grief. There's in the dual process model of grief, there's the restoration oriented processing, which is rebuilding, navigating what's that life beyond. And obviously, there's that rebuilding whilst also holding on to what, how can you stay a part of the soccer world?
Yeah,
And you mentioned around therapy. I think you mentioned around 2020 was when you started to really realize that actually, was it 2020 when you started to realize actually this is a grief, this is a loss. Did that coincide as well with your writing and you starting to bring the themes of grief into the space of words on a page?
definitely. Because I always say that the arts, any creative arts, is like a direct cut to the heart. And I was always very academically sound. So I'm very good at intellectualizing things, but to actually feel and actually sink in is it was very difficult for me when I was younger. But when I began writing, I think because I was falling into all of my emotions as a human through therapy, it became a seamless transition to get into creative writing in the arts and kind of pour all of my emotions and feelings into that. And I think that vulnerability is what makes my work unique. And I think it's the foundation, for me getting into writing. So yeah, I definitely say so.
Wow. And I think that vulnerability that you bring to your writing is something that makes that your storytelling very, very different. Because as you shared in your own personal story, it's not just loss of that identity of you as a soccer player and of that dream. Actually, it's when we go through these experiences, it's much more complex, it's much more multi-layered. And as you shared as well, there is also that those different phases. As you shared, the initial rebirth afterwards was something that was still very much of the soccer world and training to be a coach and all of those things, but actually then there's the other phases that comes through. And I think that there's so many layers when it comes to us facing into our losses and navigating that forwards path beyond. So with the forwards path beyond in mind as well, you have had rebirth. It feels like from our conversation, you've had rebirths
Yeah.
beyond. And you've mentioned around as a coach, as with your nonprofit as well that you used to run, obviously as an author. So I'd love for you to share anything around that, the rebirths that you experienced it, and actually when it comes to obviously that big loss and the grief, how that grief perhaps was a catalyst for then what was to come.
I was thinking about if I ever had kids one day, reflecting on what I've gone through, what would I tell them? And I think one of the things that it's an interesting juxtaposition when you are very competitive in a sport or any creative discipline, any discipline in life. Part of it has to become your entire world so you can become great. But you're also going to miss out on a lot of life if you have one singular focus that drives your entire identity. So I think it was really great to have, quite frankly, a lot of free time.
Mhm.
There was no more traveling. There was no more double practice after school. School ended at about, well, that was high school. So high school ended around 2:30 or something like that. So then from 2:30 for the rest of the day, it's like, what are you going to do? And then on the weekends, what are you going to do? So because I lost so much,
Mm.
there was almost this arrogant confidence to try new things and just say, it can't get any worse than it already has. So might as well see what I can get into. And so, yeah, the first thing was getting my national coaching license. And I had to wait till I was 16 because you have to be 16 in the US. So I actually became my region's youngest nationally licensed coach.
Wow.
That definitely helped my nonprofit as far as getting word out and getting opportunities for me to conduct programs. And I also reflected on my younger years where here in America, we have the pay to play rule where, training is so expensive for young talent. And if you're good, you may not have access. You may not make it if you don't have the resources. So that's what I targeted through my nonprofit.
Mm.
So I almost looked through the doorway of my own pain to see what can I do and how can I turn this into purpose in a way. So that was where I began. And then the writing kind of marinated and then materialized as I got into college. And it was really when COVID happened and I couldn't coach anymore because we were all inside. And I decided to get into writing. But in high school, I had a teacher who, after I quit playing, I signed up for a creative writing elective. And I had a teacher who asked me, she saw that I had a mind that could get very creative and just maybe I hadn't tapped into it fully. And she asked me to rewrite a Shakespeare play as a contemporary comedy and make it into a screenplay. And I'd never done something like that before. So I was like, you want me to do this in front of people and then I have to get people to act it out? I was like, I don't know how this is going to work. But it ended up being really fun. and I was able to bring that world into contemporary context. And I think that opened the door in my brain, and I was like, this writing stuff is kind of interesting. And I call that the marination phase, because then when I got into college, I'd already been thinking creatively, and that led to me publishing my first book and just diving fully into that world. So yeah, I think that devastation with my soccer career,
Mhm.
it laid the pathway for new foundations, and I wouldn't have even had the bandwidth to have those new foundations if I was still completely focused on being an athlete. So I'm grateful for it now.
Mm. Wow. That is so profound, showing those the new blossoms of opportunities that can come through. And obviously blossoms is very in alignment
Yes,
with your
yes,
first novel. And I think as well what's really coming through for me is the when I think about how grief can be a catalyst, how loss can be a catalyst, what I can feel is that there was a real determination in your energy, because to publish your first book when you were in college, like how old were you when your first book was published?
I was 19.
Wow.
I was like a it was this summer break between my sophomore and my junior year. So I was going into my third year. Yeah, I was 19. Yes.
Wow. Oh my goodness. I mean, I was thinking about what I was doing at the age of 19, and I was probably wasting a lot of time. Like, that is absolutely incredible. And
Thank you.
what, as well, I can really connect into as well is the as we spoke about before, the vulnerability that you bring into your writing, and the fact that actually you don't shy away from difficult topics, and that is really a reflection of the realities of our world that is so underserved, I think, in our stories. So I would love to dive into the themes, particularly of your two novels. So we've got Battle Scars and Blossoms, which was your second book that you published. And so should we start there before we go into When the Record Stops Spinning? Let's start with Battle Scars and Blossoms, and the themes, because this book is really, for me, what resonates is just what an important story it tells when it comes to trauma, when it comes to mental health, when it comes to a lot of stuff that actually I think our society teaches us to punch down and to run away from. But as your writing shares, you can only run for so long. So yeah, tell us a little bit around Battle Scars and Blossoms.
Yeah, so it was inspired by my experiences in therapy. When I started going to therapy, I was 17. I was in my first year at university, and it was my first time being on my own, away from my family.
Mm.
And there's a line in the book where the main character's mom says to him, "Silence is often very loud." And that's how I felt, because I was spending a lot of time on my own. And that's when all the things you've been running from are like, hey, we're still here. We've been waiting for you. And now we're going
Mhm.
to sneak attack you. And so I was interested in, I was also studying psychology in college. And I just realized how alienating mental health conversations were. And it's funny because, I mean, you're in the mental wellness space, and there's a lot of vulnerability, but when it comes to everyday normal people, these things are not normalized. Even though we have X, Y, and Z amount of charities and programs, if you're on the street every day, these things are not, we have a long way to go, basically.
Mm.
So I was just thinking about what's a good way to engage people and make these conversations normal. And I know for me, when I watch a good story, when I read a good story, I'm just falling into the world. And whatever lessons I find are just a benefit, but I can focus on the story in a way where I don't feel like I'm being judged. And I knew I could do that for other people. And I can also share my own story. It was really a revelation to think about the fact that I neglected my mental health for the first 16 years of my life, perhaps unknowingly. And so I crafted a plot where the main character has been through a very traumatic childhood, losing a loved one in a fatal accident, among family dynamics, toxic dynamics, and has really just shoved all of it to the side and arrives in college, and his mom creates an ultimatum with him because she recognizes his unhealthy way of dealing with trauma. And she says, I'm only going to pay your fees for school if you agree to go to therapy. And he's very ignorant about the concept of therapy and emotional expression. And I wanted to have his character arc reflect the conversations we hear about therapy and mental wellness. I'm not crazy, so I don't need to do that. And like, I'm a man, so that stuff is for weak people, and that's more feminine, and blah 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 blah. All these unhealthy things we hear about mental wellness. I wanted that all reflected in the main character. And so it's really a journey about he gets into a lot of comedic ultimatums as he tries to find loopholes around the agreement, but ultimately has to learn to prioritize his mental wellness. But he has to kind of come to that conclusion on his own. Because often we're people that we kind of have to crash the car ourselves to then learn the bigger lesson. Often, people give us advice and we just need to experience it for ourselves. And so it's really that journey. And I wanted to just show the importance of expressing yourself and dealing with the things you go through. Because if you don't, they're going to come back and find you, usually at the worst time. So that was really a goal. And it was really beautiful to be able to go into schools and work with students and have them process the stories. And I even explored the way parental influence influences how we think about mental health. So part of the main character's mindset comes from the things he heard from his mom and dad. And I wanted to explore that because we are a sum of our surroundings in many ways. And the things we hear or pick up on can affect how we approach the world. So it's been really beautiful just to have that in the world and have people digesting a story like that. And they can just enjoy the comedy. There's a bit of romance. It's kind of fun and cute, first love situation, but there's still that heart and that important message. So, yeah.
I think that's such a powerful example of the power of storytelling, because you're right, these conversations need to be normalized, because yeah, we are all aware of mental health, but exactly to your point, it does feel like, whether that's in our families, and obviously there's a lot of stuff that is as well generational, and if I think about, yeah, my parents and certain conversations around mental health that I know just wouldn't resonate, and I know there's a lot that they passed down to me and my brother. But also, I think in everyday conversation, even with that awareness, there's that lack of that ability to be able to hold these conversations. And particularly as you shared, when it does come to men, for example, and just being able to sit and say, actually, yeah, have you considered that therapy might be a brilliant option, or those sorts of things? So that storytelling feels absolutely essential. And I love, am I right in thinking that, I suppose, how many threads were woven from your personal experiences into your storytelling? Was that very much the inspiration based upon your therapy journey and themes that perhaps came up?
Yeah, a lot of it was my own experiences. And then I blended it also with the things I've seen around me.
Hmm.
There's one scene very early on, this is not really a spoiler, where it's the main character's birthday. And that's a moment where it's a joyous day, but grief hits him then for some
Hmm.
reason. Because I think he's thinking about his own celebration of life and how that contrasts with the loss of life he's trying to process. And it hits him in that moment. And he tries to put on a brave face for his birthday. It kind of gets found out by his family. And that actually happened to me on my 18th birthday.
Wow.
I was grieving the loss of some loved ones and some friends I lost growing up. And I don't know why it decided to hit me on my 18th birthday. And I remember getting taken out by my family to like a frozen yogurt shop. And I was putting on a brave face, but I'd just been crying. I just been crying for like hours in my college room before. So there's a lot of scenes that I just kind of manipulated or changed a bit, but they were rooted in my experience. Um, and I do think that was healing in a way, especially learning to give myself grace, because it almost felt really, really foolish in a way. Because some of the things you watch the main character go through, I guess because you can have a bird's eye view, you're like, why would you do that? Why would you not understand that you need to deal with this? But it was also this is why, this is how things got this way. This is how you learn to think that way. And for me, that allowed me to give myself grace because I did beat myself up for a while, saying I could have started this journey way earlier, and I would have been a lot more quote unquote healed. Um, but I was like, we all have to learn things at our own time. So it's important to also be kind to ourselves and forgive ourselves for not knowing what we didn't know at a certain time.
Oh, what a powerful, powerful lesson. I think we all need to remember to give ourselves grace, and particularly because there's some people I'm sure who don't come to these sorts of journeys until, I don't know, in their 70s or whenever, but actually we can beat ourselves up, or as you shared, we can take, and I love that, taking that bird's eye view, being able to step back. And I love how your writing is enabling you to be able to, I suppose, explore your own experiences in grief, in trauma, but through that different lens of being able to step back. And it really resonates with me because when I've been on my grief journey and writing my story when it comes to losing our daughter, I found it really cathartic to be able to just be able to get everything out. To your point around all those moments where there's a lot that's sitting inside of me that is really uncomfortable to acknowledge, whether it's anger or shame or other stuff that comes up, but actually being able to journal on it. And obviously, I mean, one day it will form my memoir and her memoir that is going to be released to the world. But for now, it is very much just me and my journal. And I think there is something about when you can get the words out of your mind, out of your heart, and just pour it out onto a page. There's something in just being able to then read it back, take that step back, and say, okay, am I being harsh on myself right now? Or yeah, do I need to give myself grace? Do I need to give myself love? Do I need to look at it and go, hey, look how far you've come? Because that's definitely things that I've experienced in my own, I suppose, more amateur version of writing that I think can be really, really powerful. And I suppose that's why there's a lot of research that shows writing is a form of therapy. It can be really, really therapeutic and help us in our healing.
Yeah, I think it can teach you, going back to the way creativity is just a direct cut to the heart. It's the emotions become intertwined, and then you have to kind of look at it all. And I do think it can help people learn to look through the lens of love at their own life because we are our worst critics most of the time. And it's hard to process things sometimes when you're just in the thick of each moment. So, yeah, I think for reflection purposes, writing is a beautiful form of therapy and something I'd advocate for everybody to get into or at least try.
Love that. And what would you recommend if someone's listening to this and thinking, all right, I want to pick up that pen, but I don't even know where to start. What would you recommend? How could we create? Is there a writing practice? What could we do?
So, one thing I just heard from somebody is I just heard somebody say that when you're going through a moment, and this is it could be difficult, but I think it'd be very helpful. When you're going through a moment, write down your raw, very visceral reaction, and then come back in a month and look at it again and write how you feel about it now, and then come back in 3 months and look at that and write how you feel about it after 3 months and what you've learned and how you can use what happened to you to realign your perspective to move forward. And I think if you look at that three-dimensional process, I think it can be very reflective because you don't need to have a definitive answer at any point. You just need to write down what you're feeling, what you're processing, what you're conceptualizing, and then you'll be able to see those mental shifts from like this three-dimensional point of view. So I'd recommend that, and I plan to do that the next time something's heavy on my heart. So I'd probably recommend that.
Wow, I love that as a practice because also there's a beautiful acknowledgement to the point around squiggly lines, but there's a beautiful acknowledgement that these paths aren't linear and that actually that looping back is really valuable because otherwise we do tend to just move forwards, we move on, and that aligns into that belief in our culture of you should be over this by now. That's
Yes.
very much that linear path forwards, but actually that looping back is just that check in. Actually, where am I at right now? And that acknowledgement that with all of really difficult losses or other challenges in life, actually, there's often layers to it and nuances and things and shifting as well. Then there's that we do heal and we things get easier, etc. So there's also that acknowledgement. But yeah, I love that. I've just in my mind, I've just literally got these little loops going on
Yeah,
different
yeah,
experiences.
yeah. I think, yeah, we are so trained to just move on, and it's completely okay to have a hard time getting over something.
Hmm.
I have a hard time getting over a lot of things, um, and I don't have an issue admitting that anymore. I probably would have in the past felt like I need to get over things quickly, but often, and that's kind of explored in my novel as well. When you do try to move on too quickly, it's gonna come back anyways. So you might as well take that time and be empathetic towards yourself and sit with it because you're probably going to have to come back anyways if you rush that healing process. So either way, it's coming back, you know?
Oh, Micah, that is the word on grief. Exactly that. Take your time, have that empathy, and allow it because it does. It's not. We can't rush it, and actually, we aren't really able to, as much as we humans try to control everything. Like we can't. There's things you can't control, and when you are hurting about something, whatever that loss is, you've got to allow that time. You've got to allow that space and that reflection. As soon as we try and fill up our days with action, then we take ourselves away from actually feeling. So I love that invitation. And I would love as well to flow into your other novel, which is When the Record Stops Spinning. Tell us a little bit. This is a really really interesting one and a different kind of loss. So tell us a bit about this novel.
So this novel, I mean, I don't even want to say this to be biased, but it's my favorite. It's my most recent, so it's I think I spent the most time with it. It's almost like having like a child in a way. You just spend so much time bringing it to life. And it's a very unique novel. And I'll explain it uh, by looking at my writing process. I like to take a plot idea, which is like what's going to carry the story, and then I look at broader social commentary, and then I'm all about fusing those together, and that's how you create a dynamic story. So focusing on the plot, I was really interested in music as a form of healing and just the psychological power of music. So it's a story about characters who discover the ability to generate access to the past through music. Music is often a gateway. You know, you hear the phrase soundtrack to your life, and you can kind of associate emotions and feelings and times in your life with a song. And so I was just very curious, what if you could actually go back to the past using music as that trigger in a real sci-fi way? So that was kind of the plot. But of course, I think because I'm in the mental health space and because I use emotions in my work, I was very interested in linking that plot idea to grief in terms of losing your identity. So the main character is this once brilliant up and coming artist who, through a very tragic circumstance, loses his ability to create. And he finds himself in his senior year at university, and he has no idea where his life is going. And he gets offered the chance to be a part of this experiment where he gets to use music to go back to the past. And I found it to be a really dynamic confrontation of all the versions of himself that he lost. And so he has to interact with those as he revisits the past and look at the present tense concepts in retrospect with who he once was. And there's a lot of longing there. There's a lot of looking at what once was and not really being interested in what is and what could be. And I wanted to explore that because I do think while my first novel dealt with the more literal, tangible form of grief, it's often hard to validate the other forms of grief because there's often not an emotional template for what that looks like. And
Mhm.
so to have it in a story where he's going back to the past and you can see that longing, that connection, even a form of escapism in the past because he found comfort in those old times before the trauma. I wanted to explore what all that means. And I think it's tied into purpose as well, because as I said, he's a senior about to, go into the world for the first time and is trying to figure out who am I, what matters to me, like, what am I doing with my life? And so to look at purpose in that way, me personally, I really hate those just like empty-handed believe in yourself quotes about purpose. I do think we have to believe in ourselves, yes, of course. But I think the emotional nuances of grief and purpose and struggling through identity are just more complex than any one sentence could account for. So I love that in a story, I got to just factor in all of that and show that it's okay to feel things heavily and you can still fight and persevere and look to a future even while you're dealing with a very heavy heart. So it's kind of an interesting duality in that way.
Wow. I think what's coming through as well is on that the complexities of our identities, because there are so many past versions of ourselves, and particularly when, as also happened for you, when that loss is forced upon us through a tragedy, that's where I suppose it's a bigger shock, isn't it? And
Yeah.
actually what I can feel is on that again, it's that looping and the layers to be able to unearth, and obviously through that it's very kind of sci-fi, isn't it? That kind of being able to explore back through our past through music is such a wonderful construct. And when it comes to identity loss, when it is that, I mean, I think change is often, I mean, in general, all of us have change that is forced upon us. But actually, I also think that that's a grief that is really unspoken in our society. That actually, identity loss can bring up a lot. It can bring up a lot of grief. So, if we connect into both your story as well as the story in your novel, if you were to speak to someone who's maybe listening and has had change forced upon them, is there any words of wisdom, any advice, anything that you'd share with them, perhaps at that point where it feels really fresh, really raw, and as you shared, and there's that pullback, that wanting, that longing to want to go back to the past?
I would say don't gaslight yourself. That's very important. And one of the things I was really excited to explore in the novel is a character who I view the main characters in both novels as opposites of each other. In
Mhm,
my first novel, he'd moved on very quickly. And if you asked him about the past and trauma, he's not going to talk about it.
mhm,
This character is incredibly aware of the fact that he's grieving. It's not a surprise, it's not a secret. And so I think because he is feeling his emotions, there
mhm,
is room to move on, even if it's taking him a long time. So the first thing I tell anybody is do not gaslight yourself. Don't play it off. Don't say like, "Oh, I'm fine." Validate your emotions because there may be nobody else to validate those emotions but you. So
mhm,
feel what you're feeling, recognize that it's valid, and then you can begin to move from there. The second thing I'd say is when we're forced into a very dramatic or drastic life transition, it's often very absolute and all consuming. And so the easy thing for our brains to do is to look for a solution that is also very absolute and quick. But unfortunately, life usually does not work like that. And I know there's sometimes in stories where, like a fantasy magic story, where they'll just figure out their life in 2 seconds after grieving. That's not what happens in my novel, and that's not what happens in life.
yeah,
Usually you have to begin a process of compounding and you have to be realistic with the expectations you set. So I would also tell somebody, I know it's really difficult when despair grabs you all at one time, but unfortunately, most of the time you're going to have to go through a long process of discovering who you are again. And that can be overwhelming. But the thing I would say is don't focus on an end goal 50 years out in the future and say, I need to know everything in a cemented way. You can simply say, what is calling to me right now? What could I possibly be more curious to set a foundation in this season of my life, even if I don't know where it's going? And just focus there and free yourself from needing to know everything. Because life is not fair like that, unfortunately. I wish it was. And I wish that for my life. I wish I knew what 55 looked like for me. I have no idea. Um, but I'm in the moment and I'm discovering things continuously and I'm compounding. So I would say focus on that, and that will help you care for your mental health better. Because if you set a crazy standard, okay, I just lost everything, so now I need to have everything back figured out in 2 months, and then I'll be good. You're going to be devastated when you can't do that, you know? And if you can do that, wonderful, but just really set empathetic standards for your life as you figure it back all out because it's a process.
Empathy is really rooted into your essence, isn't it? And I think it's so important because you're right. And if I put myself in your shoes with your dreams of becoming a professional soccer player, and that is a dream that, as as you shared, was one that initially you were like, not really, and then you got into soccer in your own time, and then you carved your trail. So actually, to put that pressure, if you were to have put that pressure on yourself, so I've got to have this all solved in a couple of months, actually that's not an acknowledgement of the human process, the journeys that we go through, particularly I think when it comes to those moments in life where so much has of us has been governed by our identity. And actually, if you were to take yourself back to you as a 15-year-old, how all encompassing was your identity as Micah, the soccer player?
So it was all of it. And that's something I've also learned is that that grief can become even more devastating when you place such a large amount of self-worth in one element of your being. And for me, it was being an athlete. For some people, it's professional validation. For some people, it's romance, and their whole identity is about who their partner is and their relationship together. For some people, it's academic validation. My parents love seeing me on the honor roll or the performance sheet, and that's who I am. That brings me purpose. So I think it's just an important reminder, and I've learned that from my experience that we are multi-dimensional beings, and we exist. We matter just because we are. Like just because we're alive. Being alive is a miracle, first of all. Being alive is such a blessing, even when it doesn't feel like it. To live is a gift, and we have value just because of that. So, and I've written articles before, like for newspapers, about productivity culture and always placing self worth in productivity or tangible goals, but that can be very unhealthy. So it's definitely important to remind yourself of all the other dimensions of your being because those create that dynamism in who you are.
Oh, we are multi-dimensions, and I think that's really important. I actually, as you were sharing, I connected in on multiple layers of the grief that I felt when I left. That was my choice. Still felt grief when I left Formula One because I'd put so much on my professional identity. But also, if I think about the layers of, as you were sharing, I thought about my parents, and it was exactly the same. Or for my parents, it's all about that education and the university degree, and then going into, for them it was the traditional labels. And actually there's been that, I can feel there's been that that loss that they've felt in the fact that myself and my brother have actually chosen to not go down a traditional path of blazing a trail to, I don't know, a CEO in a traditional company. And actually that multi-dimensionality is so important for us, I suppose, also because what I can feel is it also doesn't pin us into one aspect of us, and that becomes again that dominant path, honoring the fact that maybe it's not even just one squiggly line, there's many different squiggly lines of us that forms this ball of our entire being. But actually those different threads that are woven could create opportunities up that path if only we are to realize just how important they are. And I call myself out on this. Actually, for my whole 14-year corporate career, I was definitely just dominated by one aspect of me.
Yeah, and it's hard because even me now, I'm thinking about writing all the time. There are
Mhm.
times when I'm woken up out of my sleep to write,
Wow.
and or I'll be in a grocery store talking to the cashier lady, and then I have a new title or a new painting I want to make for a cover. So
Wow.
I've been reminded, don't make the same mistake you made in in the athletic world of
Mhm.
letting that become my sole reason for breathing. And it's hard because when you're in the pursuit of any form of greatness, you have to kind of be addicted or just very invested in that world. So it's no different for me, but I am trying to remind myself that I'm a multidimensional being. I just became an uncle, so I'm
Oh,
focused on that.
congrats.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah. So I'm spending time with my nephew and my family and trying to just make room for other things in life because it's just important for balance, you know?
Yeah, I love that. Cultivating that balance. I think it's if you're right that that greatness does demand a lot of us when we're on those paths. And if I think even if I think about professional athletes who perhaps are exiting a career, I don't know, in their mid-30s or some a little bit later, but coming from the sports industry, you hear so many stories where actually again it's that thing of it just actually there's a wonderful athlete called Marilyn Okoro who was a guest on this podcast and she described I think she described this in another podcast of the fact that when she retired from athletics, it felt like she'd been pushed off of a cliff because there was just no preparation and no understanding of who is she. And I could imagine even from that perspective of just outside of your training, what brings you joy and little things in life, even that can often be so lacking when we are so all consumed. So I love the fact that you are so aware of it and then trying to find that balance between that pathway of greatness alongside actually let me not let this all be all consuming. I could imagine that is that some I have many different practices where I'm like this is a lifelong journey and I keep going out of balance. Is that something where you do go out of balance or how are you finding that journey of cultivating that balance?
Well, the nice thing is that I don't write all year long. I know when I am writing a novel, it becomes my whole world. And my parents called me Batman because when I start writing, because Batman's whole thing is he's like mysterious and keeps to himself, and he's like in that tower. And my parents say that when I get into a novel season, nobody can get a hold of me. Nobody like, call me out to watch a film. I'm I'm gonna be holed up writing. So I'm really trying to focus on balance more in starting things sooner and then taking more time, like working slower and letting it build. Because I used to just kind of wait until everything aligned perfectly and then I jump into any type of passion, whether it was my novels, whether it's speaking. But now what I'm trying to do is just do a little bit of everything all the time, if that makes sense. Instead of just letting one thing consume me and then coming up for air and then jumping into another thing and then coming up for air. And then I'm trying not to do that anymore because I just think that was spinning me out of balance. So now on a day-to-day basis, I will do a little bit here, take a break, do a little bit here, take a break, do a little bit here. And I feel more well-rounded in my approach to each day. So that's what I'm working on right now. We'll see if I can be consistent. That's another difficult thing is what do they say? It takes 21 days to form a good habit and to keep that habit for months and months and months. We'll see how that goes, but that's what I'm trying right now.
Wow, yeah, I love that. I feel very inspired by you because I'm definitely I bowl into, but I run out of steam. So then it's sort of like the
Me
commitment.
too. Me too.
I'm like, this is a great idea. Let's go, go, go. And then like 2 weeks later, I'm like, oh, I'm over it now. See you later. Forget about it. So I leave
Yeah.
all these different creative loops open. But actually, I love that of just little and often, and actually conscious of that balance. And before we come to my final question for you, I would love to hear because what I can feel is that creative force that's within you, whether it's in your writing, in your illustrating as well. I know obviously you're speakers, there'll be a lot of creativity that comes through that. So for anyone who might be tuning into this and has that creative spark in them, and they want to start, whether it's pouring words onto a page or perhaps other forms of creativity, what would your words of advice be of where someone could start to cultivate that creativity and that self-expression?
So I would definitely say figure out your why, because that I use the why as a north star to make all my decisions. So figure out why you're called to that space. And you don't need an incredibly profound reason. You don't need to say like I journeyed into the mountains to find inner purpose and blah blah blah. If you have a silly reason for your why, that is perfectly fine. But I do think that why creates that unified vision for what you're going to do. And I think the why will also show you what spaces to occupy. So for me, because I know all of my advocacy work is based around education, enlightenment, and empowerment, you will probably see me repeat those three E words all the time. And so that determines what I do, how I do things, who I spend my time with. It determines everything. And that why is a lot of my, not my whole North Star, but it's a big reason that keeps me on track. So that's what I'd say to anybody is figure out your why. Don't rush figuring it out. You can also you can also jump into the water and try things while you figure out your why. You might not know until you try a few things, but keep that in the back of your mind. Um, because it is gonna fuel what you do and who you become.
Oh, I love that, figuring out your why. And I think because actually I've had creative sparks where I haven't understood my why. Actually, from my podcast, I was thinking about doing this for a while, and I just sat there and I'd let my words pour out, and it wasn't in alignment. And I could feel it, so I thought, okay, I'm just going to leave this seed dormant for a while, and then it was the why of, and very much in alignment with everything that you're doing. Conversations around grief are so unspoken, and actually, we are terrible at having difficult conversations and facing into life's challenges, whether it's us acknowledging it or as a community. And it was when that why came through that then the podcast sparked, and then there was other aspects of writing and things. So I love that on figuring out your why. And as well, from everything that you shared in our conversation, what I can feel as well is also that patience of sometimes it takes a little bit of time. That's what I've realized, that actually I can feel really creative, but it's just about letting it pour out until I've got something that I'm like, okay, this is the polished seed
Yeah.
of my why. And now it's time to go in this space. And for me, actually, I thought I had a vision of, I'm gonna leave Formula One and I'm gonna figure out my creative niche and I'm gonna be a writer and I'm gonna do all this stuff. And the reality was I left Formula One end of 2021, and it took me until 2024 to figure that out. So it can take time, and that is okay. And that's what
Oh,
I could really feel from what you were sharing.
and we are all on our own timeline, and that's the thing I always tell people. Comparison is the thief of joy. Your own timeline is your timeline. And I was speaking at a book club with college students, and a few of them were talking about that pressure to finish college at a specific age. And I was telling them, when you are in your 40s, do you really think it's going to matter whether you got the bachelor's, whether you're 46 with the bachelor's or 42 with the bachelor's? That doesn't, like, nobody's going to care. Nobody's going to care at all. So often that patience comes from maybe looking bird's eye view at our lives. And in the moment you're like, I feel so much pressure to have X, Y, and Z figured out. But when you look at, I know time is a privilege and we're not always guaranteed time, but just being optimistic, I'll be optimistic. If you look at our timelines, a lot of things will be fine, even if we take a bit of time. Like, you will be fine. You'll look back, you'll be like, oh, okay, everything worked out. Things went how they were supposed to, and I'm exactly where I need to be now because I trust in the process. So I'm very big on that because I know in different seasons of our lives, we are all feeling like I just need to know everything. And it's hard to be patient, even for myself. Very hard.
Yeah, patience is my word of the year. It's what I'm practicing and I realize actually that I think in our society and culture, because there is so much out there of the overnight success stories and all of this stuff, it's almost the survivor bias in the stories that are told would have us believe that we have to have it all figured out really, really quickly, when actually if you think about it, for the majority of us, it is a slow evolution. And yeah, if we are lucky enough to have that time, actually, to for me, it was stopping thinking in a year on year, this is everything I need to achieve by the end. Because I realized I hadn't ticked off half of it by the end of every year by where I wanted my business to go and stuff. And it was really freeing to go, actually, where do I want to be in 10 years? And if I look at that, those 10 years feel really roomy and really spacious, and also give me that space to evolve as a human and go on different paths. So that was a big pivot for me. But yeah, my practice of patience definitely continues and will for my life.
Honestly, a lot of those overnight successes, those are really long nights. Those are
Yes.
those are not like, okay, overnight. Like, okay, sure, all right. That was a very long night, you know? And then a lot of times people are doing the work in the dark before it's seen. Because we only see certain
Yeah.
people. So I think that's important when we talk about patience. And I think also going back to the desire to be perceived in an ideal way, because when we talk about patience and achieving things, I know for me, I often have to check myself about being a prideful person. Like I'm thinking about, oh, why do I want to be a best-selling author with all my novels turned into films? Is it genuinely solely because of me, or is it because I want to be perceived by everybody, which is rushing up my timeline? So I think when you learn to surrender a bit of that perception, then you can naturally fix that timeline and that issue with patience. That's really helps me, is just surrendering that desire to be perceived and just focusing on whatever happens. So I would say think about that.
Wow, Micah, that is wisdom for our world that is definitely built on comparison. Who's over there? Who's doing what? How do I stack up against everybody else? And I love that surrender. It's your path and yours alone.
Yeah.
And in your path, Micah, oh my goodness, what wisdom is
Thank you.
pouring forth from you out into the world, and all born of your experiences. So just really wanted to honor you there as we come into my final question. And I end every episode by asking my guests this. If you could write a note to a past version of yourself, this could be any former version of you, could be you at 15, could be you younger, at any time in your life, what note to self would you slip to that past version of yourself?
It's a great question. And I love this because I explore this kind of thing in my novel.
I was thinking that. I was literally like, this is so aligned to
Yeah.
your
In
to
terms
your
of looking into that inner child. Yeah. So I love this. I think my note would say, breathe, this too will pass. That's probably what my note would say. Because I can be a bit dramatic. Like when bad things happen, I can be that guy who's like, "Oh, it's over. It's all over. It's
Wow.
all over." I can be that guy, and I'm still here. I'm still breathing, thankfully, and I'm still walking in a new purpose. And a lot of the things I used to worry about don't even matter anymore. There are some things I still deal with. That grief that about what happened with my career. But even worrying about those little minute things, a lot of those things don't affect my day-to-day life anymore. So I would tell my younger self at any point in my childhood, breathe, take a deep breath. This too shall pass. And hopefully I could calm him down a bit and stop him from feeling like the world is always ending.
Oh, wow, Micah. What powerful words of wisdom and powerful awareness as well. What I can really feel is that profound awareness that you bring to all of those aspects of you. And I can imagine this is much like, for me, that's why I love when we unpick those layers. It's that constant journey of just going deeper into really understanding all of the parts of us. But I think that those words are definitely words that really resonate with me, and I'm sure resonate with a lot of people who are tuning into this. And so, finally, for anyone who wants you and your writing in their world, and anything else, where can people connect with you? Tell us a bit about where we can find your books. Tell us anything just to share where people can have a bit of you in their world.
Yeah, thank you. So to keep things organized, my digital portfolio can be found at linktree.com/ my full name, Micah Dawanyi. So LINKTREE.com/MICAHDAWANYI. And that portfolio has my Instagram, my LinkedIn, my email, a direct link if you want to contact me about any opportunities. It has what social justice projects I'm working on, interviews I'm doing, radio interviews, anything I'm doing is pretty much linked to that digital portfolio. I'm the only Micah Dawanyi in the world. Fun fact. So it's not, if you look for me, I'm not that hard to find if you just search my full name. So yeah.
Love that. I will put all of the links in the show notes. And I've got both of your books on, they're on my reading list for the summer. And I cannot wait. I also can't wait to see where you go in your storytelling. Everything that I suppose for me, what I'm really blown away by is just how profound the themes that you bring into your storytelling. We caught up in our catch up before we hit record. I shared that there's another author called Witi Ihimaira, who's a Maori author who wrote in his, I think he was in his early 20s, his first novel was Tangi, it's about grief and about funeral and the loss of a father. And I just think, how profound, when I think of both of you, of your storytelling that you're bringing in at such a young age, of topics that are so essential for us to speak to in our world, but are so unspoken. And the fact that obviously all of you and your own experiences are so woven in, it feels like it's the tonic that we need in this world where a lot of these conversations are definitely pushed into the shadows. So I'm really, really grateful to you, Micah, for joining me today and for everything that you do.
Oh no, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I'm really glad we got connected, and I was so glad to do this. So thank you too.
All of my gratitude to you for joining me for another Dead Conversation. Death on the Daily is edited by David Strutt. The music is Set Free by Katie Gray. And I am Tanya Wilkinson. And if you enjoyed this episode, I would be over the moon if you can rate, review, and subscribe. It really, really helps me to get the word out there. And if you want to say hi or to hear more about my work as a coach and death doula, including how I support my clients to navigate their death on the daily, then all of the ways that you can connect with me are in the show notes. I'll be back soon with some more Dead Conversations. And in the meantime, take good care of yourself and others.
There's a cold fire, there's a crossfire, and there's something inside. And we'll never make it, and we'll never break.